Okay. Colleagues, I'm delighted to let you know that at the other end of the line here, into the west coast of the US, we have Professor Linda Darling-Hammond. I'm saying that confidently, Linda, because I'm hoping that you are in fact there. So could you just indicate that you've joined us?
I am here, and can you hear me okay?
We can hear you
see me?
absolutely perfectly, and we can see you. So we've got a double bonus. So Linda, can I just, I'm not going to delay a lot with an introduction to you because people in this room know you, but just to say that there is not another educator that we as educators here in New Zealand and globally respect more than Linda Darling-Hammond, who has led a professional conversation at research policy and practice levels across the globe in a way that I think has built our sense of status, our sense of identity, and our sense of pride in the profession. Linda Darling-Hammond has done that in a remarkable way. You have heard her before, you've read her work. I might say, Linda, just help us with this one point. My understanding, apart from actually continuing, obviously, as a professor at Stanford, you've now established a policy institute. I might just embarrass you more by saying that you're regarded as being in the top couple of policy influencers in the US. There's an annual hit list of the top of those who really do have the greatest impact. And Linda's always at the top. I just want to ask you a question, Linda. You led the transition team for the Obama administration around education. Is it true that you would be prepared to do that for either of the presumptive presidential candidates?
Only you would ask a question like that, Tony.
Well, we are hoping for the best possible outcome. When I say we, I mean the globe.
Yes.
It's
I think prayer is in order.
Hey, just say a word about the Policy Institute that you've now established and the nature of the work that you're doing, because few other people have been able to bring policy research and practice together in powerful ways, and we really need it. We need it here in New Zealand, and we need it in the US and elsewhere. But just say a word to us about the way in which you are now launching into that work.
Well, there are two things about the Learning Policy Institute that may be of interest to you. One is, of course, it is very hard to get policy made on the basis of evidence about what we know really does work, could work, has worked, and how to structure that so that it enables educators to do their best work. And as you may know, in the United States, that's been particularly difficult. We just finally left No Child Left Behind, after many years of a strategy that was not successful and was really an impediment to schools and their progress. So one of our agendas is to really not only collect and organize and conduct research, but carry it directly into the policy arena, work closely with policymakers on designing and developing the kind of policies that really enable equity and empowering education. The other piece of it that is critical is that policy, for the most part, does not really tend to understand learning and the learning challenges we have in the 21st century. We're in this moment where knowledge is expanding rapidly, where really we're in a technology explosion, a knowledge explosion all across the globe. The nature of learning has to change in schools. The nature of teaching has to respond to the demand for children to not just memorize information, but be able to access and weigh and balance and design their own products and knowledge and so on. That means schools have to change. That means systems have to change. It means policies have to change. So our agenda is really to enable the kind of learning that young people need in this century in this arena to be supported by policy rather than having to push against old ideas that are engaged in policy that keep us from moving forward as rapidly as we need to.
Well, that couldn't be a better way of thinking about the challenge that we have here in New Zealand for this gathering today, because as you know, the Education Council, established in order to promote precisely the agenda that you've just outlined, working with the support of the profession and with the support of the ministry and minister, all of the key stakeholders. That is the task that we have. And as you also know, Linda, it's a really important day for us because we're launching the leadership part of this agenda in a very serious way. You have seen a copy of the Leadership for Communities of Learning that was distributed toward the end of last year, released toward the end of last year, and now there's the beginning of about 10 regional conferences across this great country over the next several months to talk about what this will mean. And as you point out, it's a different learning system that we're talking about with different learning challenges and with an understanding of precisely the way in which you've articulated what the learning agenda is. Linda and I had a conversation, colleagues, just yesterday about the way in which we might try and conduct the conversation. By the way, Linda, Hekia Parata, the minister who you know well, Linda has been a major contributor to a series of international summits on the teaching profession over the last 5 to 6 years, and our minister here has been a significant contributor. Linda, you know the agenda that the minister has been articulating at those gatherings that uniquely have ministers and teacher union leaders. A number of people in this room have participated in those gatherings, sitting together, thinking about the way in which we can improve teacher and leader policy. Linda's been a fantastic contributor to those events, so you know the New Zealand context. Let me just say a couple of quick things so that we can start this off in the way that Linda and I thought would be best. There's a sense, I think, in which there's 3 parts to the conversation that we might engage in, and if I tell you the 3 parts and ask Linda to stimulate each, after each part, can I open it up to a conversation in the room? And not one Q&A at a time, but maybe 3 or 4 reactions, comments from colleagues here, Linda, so you get a feel of how people are receiving the contribution that you are making and what their issues are. But I'm going to tell you the 3 parts in advance so you don't ask a question that trespasses on part 3, okay, before we get there. I'm saying that, Linda, with huge optimism, because as you well know, educators never take any notice of a suggestion of that kind. But here's the 3 parts. The first part we thought was, could we focus on what we see as the challenge for the school leader? I know we're all about communities of learning, and that means we're going to be getting into the collaboration and the networking. But just to begin with, could we ask the question, Linda, of you, what you see as being the real challenge for a school leader in their particular community to get great learning outcomes? And by the way, we are talking, as Minister Parata made clear this morning, and I think, Barbara, the same with your opening comments, we're talking about a different set of outcomes. This is not the old metrics. This is not narrow excellence. This is what we regard as being the full range of learning outcomes that we want if we're going to graduate young people who are going to continue to learn and be thriving in this environment. That's a different order, yep. So that's part 1. What does it mean to be leading in a single site institution in a community with that in mind? Part 2 will be, what does it mean to do that through a serious investment in collaboration, partnership? How do we think about a more network-based system? And that's got more players in it than perhaps just those that we've always seen as being our immediate partners. There's a range of other organisations, institutions. There's the not-for-profits, there's the social entrepreneurs, there's the corporate sector. All of these people, in addition to teachers and parents and young people in their communities, there's a lot of other people who are in the learning business in the learning game, and what does it mean to collaborate and partner in ways that can lift the performance of our communities. And that really does go to the heart, I think, of the communities of learning, Cole. And as you know, Linda, that's at the heart of today's conversation. We are launching a concept here that seriously embraces communities of learning and what's going to be the leadership challenge. That's very much part 2. Part 3 is what the Minister was referring to this morning about this is not a reproduction of the old system. This is not some kind of tinkering at the edges of a previous top-down hierarchical control model. Part 3 of the conversation we want to have is, what is the leadership of the whole system going to look like? That's different roles and responsibilities for the centre, for the local, not just roles and responsibilities, different accountabilities. What's that going to look like? I said to Linda on the phone just yesterday, you know, what does it look like to have leadership at different levels? But even the notion of level is a language which invites you back into a sense of system, which is not an ecosystem, but it still gives you a sense of different levels of authority and hierarchy. I mean, it's awkward for us. When we have the panel, we're going to get into this in terms of complexity theory and network theory. I mean, it's tough work. But part 3, in a nutshell, Linda, I think is to think about how we will lead a reconfigured system. So, colleagues, that's the agenda we've got for the next 45 minutes. And so part 1, Linda, if you can remember part 1 after that introduction, part 1's really just bringing us back to our own immediate environments, our school, the challenges we have in leading that, because that doesn't go away when you partner and collaborate. You've still got your own place. And the learning outcomes that we now aspire to. As you say, it's no longer a narrow, no child left behind. So just set us up. How would you pitch the challenges for leadership in that context?
Well, I guess there are several things I would raise. One is that the conception of a leader in this kind of context and system is not that of just an administrator, where you go into a school and you take the structures and the way it works as a given, and then you administer that organization. Make sure that the buses run on time and that, you know, things happen as they have happened in the past. Right now, for most leaders at the school level, and this is also true at the system level, we're in the process of redesigning. So leaders need to be, of course, instructional leaders, and that means and the nature of instruction is changing. So I'll come back to that, but how do we think about leading this kind of changing learning and instructional environment? Leaders need to be organizational developers. In many cases, that may mean that they're creating new designs for how schools operate, not just administering old designs. They're developing the organization in terms of distributing leadership and responsibility so that people can work in collaboration and so that the wide variety of leadership roles can be undertaken in a coherent and connected way, but it's not all one person doing all of that work and making all of the decisions. There's a shared decision-making component that's really necessary. And then the third thing is that a leader in this context has to be a change manager. There's a change management agenda that everyone faces that requires connections to the community and a way to enable deep community understanding of the work of the schools and connections in that regard, as well as the management of a change process with staff and even with students, because kids are used to the way schools have been for them. And they too have to think about this new kind of learning. Now, some schools are far down this path. and others are elsewhere on the path. Now, when I say this path, partly what I'm talking about is the fact that, schools all over the world have been organized around things like transcripts and grades and courses which impart certain information, and in places like the U.S., testing and test scores. That's less the case in New Zealand, but assessments have had a particular kind of quality of the transmission of information as a key function of schools. And of course, we still need to transmit information, but we need to do it in a way that acknowledges the explosion of information and the fact that kids have to become information managers, and they have to become developers of knowledge, not just recipients of knowledge. So the kind of learning they're engaging in is going to be more project-based, more product-oriented, more design thinking-oriented than in the past. I live in Silicon Valley, right near Google and Yahoo and Facebook and all kinds of places like that. And if you go to Google, they will no longer ask you for your transcript, for your grades, for your test scores. They used to do that. They used to assemble all that information and make very rigorous selection decisions about employees. They don't use any of that now because they did a set of studies that found that that was completely unpredictive of success in this high-tech, fast-moving, collaborative work environment. So now they try to figure out your learning ability. And learning ability is evaluated based on setting you problems and tasks in collaboration with others, where you have to go find information. You have to figure out what information you need. You have to put it together. You have to design something and test it and figure out if it works, and do all of that in a collaborative way. And if you can do that, then you're a good bet for working in this new economy. So that's the kind of work that kids are going to need to be doing in schools, and leaders are going to be leading the transformation of the curriculum, the adult learning that's needed to design pedagogies for that, the organizational redesign needed to support it, and then the change management with everyone that enables the community to move together forward in co-inventing these environments.
Linda, just before I go to the floor, so colleagues, be ready in a moment, because Linda S., there are so many Lindas in this room, Linda. So I've now got to identify them by the initial of their surname. Linda, you've got a microphone. I've got a microphone. I'm going to bring it to people in a moment. So indicate early if you'd like to come in. But let me just ask you this. We've often talked about the leadership of improvement, innovation, and change. And we're talking about that from the very earliest of years. I mean, in this room, we've got people spread across all stages and phases of learning, from early childhood through to post-secondary, further and higher education. I mean, as you think about the challenge you've just laid out, how do you see that mix of improvement, innovation and change, and how do you see it playing out across the stages and phases? Does it look very different at different points in the learning journey? So those two questions, phases, stages, but also I'll often hear people just put into the one sentence, I'm now leading, learning for improvement, innovation and change. They seem to me to be conceptually different.
Yeah, I think that they are. Let me start by saying I think that this task is not an entirely disruptive task. There's been a lot of talk about disrupting, for change and innovation. We have to build on the successes that people have already accomplished. We have to build on experience. You can't just pull the rug out and say, now we're going to do something entirely different. So there is an incremental improvement component to any good change management process. But there has to be room for innovation, and then you have to figure out how to sort of spread and scale that innovation. Some very successful businesses have a set of processes where they're always looking at how they're doing. They routinize those things that are working well so that you can improve general practice, and then they have an innovation group that's always looking at, where can we take the next steps in pioneering and innovate, and then bring that innovation back into the improvement space. And schools have to figure out a way to think about those tasks also, so that the glue that holds the community together, the glue that allows me as a practitioner to build on my practice is still there, but there are those who are ready to really invent some of the next steps, are enabled to do that, to try things out, and then for others to learn together about how those innovations are working. In terms of the levels, I think a lot of what we have to do in the education space right now, which is allowing kids to learn by inquiring and discovering and drawing inferences and evaluating and thinking things through and creating things, et cetera, is what happens routinely in great preschool education, in early education. And in a way, we need the folks in that sector to be helping those who've been in a more constrained space. The space for learning becomes more constrained as you move from early childhood to elementary or primary to secondary in most societies, because we've had ideas about what secondary schools have to prepare you for that begin to make more of the burden fitting into a variety of constraints than were apparent earlier in the learning career. So I actually think that this is easier for those in the early childhood space if they're engaged in that kind of inquiry and discovery learning, and we need to allow our colleagues in the tertiary and secondary spaces, and I'm an old high school teacher, to be able to borrow from and bring those kinds of practices back into the upper grade levels.
Yeah, that's great. By the way, I think, Linda, your point about the early years and then your reference to Google, if in a decade or more time, or maybe less, there are other employers and institutions of further and higher education that are not looking for particular forms of certification and qualification, a lot of what we see as being barriers and constraints that push down on the learning system could well be removed, allowing us to flourish around, as you say, problem-based, product-oriented, inquiry-oriented work. So it'd be great to come back to that point. Colleagues, Linda, let tables just have a minute or two to have a quick buzz, and then I'm going to see if I can get 3 or 4 questions to come back to you, okay? Be back in a second.
Sounds good.
Right. Have
okay.
A quick, colleagues, just have a quick chat amongst yourselves, but those who would like to come in early, Linda, whereabouts are you? You got a microphone?
I'm in California.
Great, there's one over there. What did she say?
I'm in California.
All right, okay. One there. Is there another one just before you come in? Is there another one here? Let me just get a bit of an indication. Anybody want to come in? James, you want to come in, don't you? Can you bring back up? Linda, thank you. Colleagues, let me just reconvene you. Linda, I'm going to just check that you can hear the question. I'm going to ask people just to introduce themselves. But first of all, I just want to make sure that you can hear this direct. So can you just say a word?
Hi, Linda.
Can you hear that?
Hi, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay, by the way, Linda, what's the temperature in California?
It's about 75 today.
Yeah. Okay,
75
great. Good.
Fahrenheit. Beautiful day.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, first question, and just again, introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, dear Linda. I'm Renee. I work in the ECE sector, and I've done a lot of work also with Dr. Michael Peters. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He's working a lot on the philosophy of openness and open education systems and open knowledge economy. And I guess my question comes in terms of, so I worked a lot around trying to transfer the curriculum from early childhood into the primary and secondary, you know, in terms of the values that you were talking about of curiosity and exploration, innovation, creativity. And I guess my question is around how to connect efficiently the public education sector of primary with the early childhood sector, which is predominantly private, how to create some kind of hubs around that on how we could collaborate and work together. So I've been part of a cluster as well. I've been leading a cluster over in Rotorua with early childhood centers and schools coming together. We had some really awesome outcomes that came out of it. So I'm just looking how could we make that bigger.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to take a second. That was okay, was it, Linda? You can hear clearly enough?
Yeah.
Great, okay. I've got another one.
Kia ora, Linda. My name's...
Can we just get that microphone working there?
Kia ora, Linda. My name's Martin James. I'm interested in, for the school leader, how do you, through policy and other structures, create those enabling leadership conditions to achieve those outcomes in terms of that change management, that change behaviour strategy that we're looking for and seeking?
Thank you very much. And do I have a third? Because I want to take it now, and after Linda's response, go on to part two. So if you'd like to raise a question on part one. Linda, have you got any takers over there? Do I have any here? Okay, let me just be clear. After part two, there will be 3 questions. Okay, so, okay, Linda, have a go at those 2.
Tony.
Oh, yes, there is another one. Okay, just before you do, Linda, I got a third.
Hi, my name's Alan Jackson. I'm in primary sector. Just around the thinking around this kind of paradigm shift, if you want to think of it in those terms, in terms of what children will experience in their learning and the skills that will be of value to them. What's your thinking around how we measure that, and what changes might be needed in how children are assessed, and I suppose our accountability in relation to those things? How do you marry those 2 things?
Beautiful. Wow. Great question. Thank you. Fantastic. That's not to say the other 2 weren't good. Okay, so Linda, over to you.
So thanks for all these really easy questions. On the first one about transferring curriculum and knowledge from the early childhood sector to the public sector, and I think the point was made that I guess in New Zealand the early childhood sector is mostly private. So there is also kind of jumping over the public and private wall. And I'd love for the gentleman who asked that question to also give you his answer, because he's already involved in this with some successes. I do think your audience will benefit from learning from him what's already going on in New Zealand around this. I think that bringing people together around thinking through sort of shared work around alignment and learning progressions, and how we can think, sharing what their curricular strategies are now and how those could be even better aligned around the concept of learning progression would be a very exciting thing to do in this regard. Obviously, the other piece is to deeply root the work and preparation of all teachers in conceptions of child development and learning of this kind. So quite often we may find that the teachers who have worked in early childhood and early primary can be of service to other colleagues in explaining how they do the magical work that they do when kids are all in different centers working on different things, producing a variety of kinds of projects and products. Once I was with some students of mine in graduate school, and as a compliment, one of them said to me, you really teach like a high school teacher, which I once was. And I said, well, thank you, I appreciate that, but if I get good, I'll teach like a preschool teacher. So I think there is that, magical work of knowing how every child learns and understanding their learning growth and development and finding the zone of proximal development and making sure that they're doing hands-on experiential work that adds up to conceptual understanding that I think many of us can learn from if we can tap that in a professional development context as well. And I guess that is related to the answer I would give the second gentleman who asked about how do you really enable this kind of school leadership to emerge. Obviously, some part of it is around the kind of professional learning opportunities we provide for leaders. That allow them both to learn from each other, identify places that are really stretching in certain areas, and I'm a big fan of field trips and site visits and go see what colleagues are doing, and really we need to be sure the system is providing the time and the opportunity for that kind of learning. The other thing that the policy system needs to do is to fight the urge to regulate and prescribe overly much. There is a sort of an inverse relationship between the amount of investment we put in people and their knowledge, skills, competence, expertise, and the desire of governments to regulate them. The less we trust the people in the system, in the schools, the more there's a tendency to want to create regulations. The more we trust the competence of people because we've invested in it, the more we feel comfortable as society to let them make decisions that will move things forward. At a time of change, at a time of radical change in the society, we need to resist the temptation to overregulate schools so that they can change, but provide incentives and opportunities for learning about how to make that kind of change and really provoke the opportunities for innovation. So innovation policy is very different from sort of compliance-oriented policy. And I think we have to look to the policy system also to develop leadership that incentivizes and supports learning for innovation and innovation for learning rather than a compliance framework. While still being vigilant to protect the rights of minorities and to protect the confidence that the public can have that every child will get access to a high-quality education. To the last question, how do we measure this kind of learning in this paradigm shift? That's a wonderful question. I did a book about a year ago called Beyond the Bubble Test, which assembles a lot of the evidence from around the world about ways to support, to assess and measure the kind of learning that we're now looking for. Obviously, a lot of this has to do with performance assessments and tasks where kids are actually given the kinds of opportunities and challenges to inquire into a situation or a problem, to evaluate evidence and data, to put it together, whether it's in a a sort of a literary analysis, or whether it's in a social science inquiry, or whether it's in a scientific investigation, in a way that they are demonstrating that they can apply the knowledge that they are finding and developing, as well as have had transmitted to them, in ways that are able to address problem solving and design and solution production. And those kinds of assessments, which you have in some parts of the system in New Zealand, and certainly there are examples that have occurred in Australia as well. You know, the rich tasks that Queensland developed, and the kinds of project work tasks that Singapore uses in the secondary school that are collaborative. They can be assessed. Teachers can still evaluate and score those on many dimensions, including you know, the quality of the work and the logic of the answer, and the adequacy of the design and the inferences. And also things like collaboration, which is going to be kind of the coin of the realm in terms of the way work gets done in the future. So we are going to have to shift our paradigm of measurement and be comfortable with the idea that collaboration is a skill. For example, to be developed, it's not cheating. You know, that's perhaps a U.S. construct, that if you let kids learn from each other and with each other, there's somehow cheating involved. That's going to also be part of that evolving paradigm of new assessment.
That's great. Thank you, Linda. Okay, let me see if we can move into, in a sense, I think what you were addressing in your response to Martin, the second question, that is the nature of the leadership challenge and the way in which we think about our learning community or learning communities. Let me say this to you. You and I both know that New Zealand has been in the forefront of innovation and change in relation to networking. Now, there's a history, a recent history, of very significant work in establishing learning networks across the country. Some people have still thought that has been beautiful exceptions or innovation trapped on location, and that it hasn't had perhaps the impact at the entire system level. The Minister this morning made it clear that the government's current policy of investing in educational success is designed to place the communities of learning at the heart of the system. In other words, communities of learning will in fact be the signature of the new system. It'll be the DNA of the system. We're talking about rolling these out across the entire country over the next period of 6 to 10 schools in a community of learning, and that's the way in which we'll be thinking about the system. Now, we'll return in part 3 to what that means for reconfiguring the entire system and the role of the centre. Yep. But in part 2, you know a fair bit about a kind of network-based approach, communities of learning, what that really does mean in terms of collaboration and partnership. And this is not just, as I mentioned before, collaboration and partnership with those who are most centrally involved in the learning game, but a range of others at community and business level who are very much part of our work. So in part 2, can you have a go at where you think the state of the art is? It may well be New Zealand, but it'd be great for you to draw upon what you have been witnessing and in fact have been both researching and advising on in terms of what the power of collaboration can really bring us in terms of great learning outcomes, which, as you said before, is for all. This agenda is about excellence and equity. And your point, I think, is be very careful that people don't miss out as you redesign the system.
Right.
Yep. Have a go at that one.
Well, that's a great question, because collaboration can be very powerful, but it is not always easy, and you have to learn how to do it, and you have to structure it in ways that can be productive. There's an old African proverb that if you want to go somewhere fast, go alone. If you want to go a long way, go together. That, it is easier sometimes to just do something without a whole collaborative process attached to it, whether it's an individual in a school or whether it's in a network of schools that are working with each other or in some other collaborative context. I think there's several things that we're learning are important to have in place for collaboration to be productive. I mean, you start by saying you have to find out how to make time for collaborative work. You can't just pilot on the, existing system, and sometimes that means reorganizing. So if you even think about within a school, the TALIS surveys that you and I remember being presented at the last International Teaching Summit showed a wide variation across the world in the amount of time that teachers have that's not devoted to frontal teaching, to, being with kids, in the classroom in direct contact. In Shanghai primary schools, for example, teachers teach about 15 hours a week, and the rest of the time spent in a variety of tasks, including very intensive collaborations around lesson study, around action research, around curriculum development collectively. In a place like the United States, teachers are teaching almost twice as many hours a week, very little time for that collaboration, and then it becomes necessarily more superficial. So obviously, you've got to make room for collaborative work to go on productively, but once you've got the time, you've got to have shared work that is meaningful and valuable to the people involved in it. Whether it's educators within a school that are taking up shared work around curriculum development or school improvement activities, or whether it's folks in the network who are working across schools, the work has to be jointly meaningful. And then you need access to internal and external knowledge sources. Sometimes the wisdom that's needed is within the group. And if you have important, meaningful shared work and time to do it, the way to move forward, the way to share knowledge and skill that can move the group forward is right there within the group. Other times you need access to external expertise, ideas, examples. So the collaborative process has to also allow for learning resources to be made available that can expand the knowledge base and the horizons of the existing group. You need opportunities for reflection on what's working, what's not working. Can we change course? There has to be that flexibility to say, well, okay, we started out, working collaboratively on this problem. We now see that the problem is actually a little different than we imagined it was. We need to shift our frame, or we need to change our strategy. That also needs to be plausible and expected. And then you need the group that is collaborating to get work done to have decision-making authority to act on what they're learning. So all of those things are kind of part of building a context for effective collaboration, whether it's across a network, within a school, or even ultimately at a system level.
So just when I counted up five ways in which we could deliberately undertake the work to have effective collaboration. Is that therefore the task of obviously all leaders, but in particular, if I have joint leadership responsibility for a coal, is that my work? I'm thinking now about the distinction between the leadership that I was exercising in part 1 as a school leader, and now the leadership that I'll be exercising as the leader of a COL. Would you make distinctions between the two, and is my leadership work pretty much that I tackle the 5 areas that will produce effective collaboration?
Well, I think those are good starting points in both cases. I think there are some probably additional leaders have to be learners in order to do this kind of leadership work well. They have to know a lot about where the expertise on various things may lie within the group, where good examples and ideas may come from, so that they can invite them in. They can, help people feel empowered to share with each other. So if you're leading in a school, you know that this teacher in this classroom is doing really spectacular work on something. Another teacher in another classroom is doing wonderful work on something else, and you can bring those ideas into the collaborative process. The same thing will be true in networks. The leader of a network is going to have to know a lot about the context and the activities and the successes and the strengths that members of that network can bring to the learning of their colleagues, so as to begin to build on the experience base. It's just like learning theory. You always have to build on prior knowledge and prior experience to help people take the steps towards their next epiphanies or awareness. You need to know a lot about the learning community in order to enable them to build on their strengths and to share them.
Yep, brilliant. Let me do a quick pause again. Ask tables just have a conversation for a couple of minutes amongst themselves, and then I'll come back with 2 or 3 questions, yeah? Okay,
Sounds
great.
good.
Good. Okay, Linda, we're back on. Thank you, colleagues.
Good.
Thank you very much. Okay. So, Linda, I'm just going to take a couple of questions before we move on to part 3. And part 3 is, just to anticipate, is going to be on the role of the centre. I can guarantee you there'll be more questions at the end of part 3. But, Colin, do you have just introduce yourself and a question on part 2 on collaboration and COLs?
Yes, I'm Colin Dale. Fortunate to work with Tony before, which is why he inveigled me to ask you this question. One of the things that I think we find difficult, and probably every COL finds difficult, is how do you deal with set mindsets? We use deep questioning, but I think we need more expertise about how to shift entrenched mindsets.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Is the microphone still with Eva? No, it's not. Okay, I need one other question. One other joining us? Yeah. Yeah. Eva, did you want to come in or not? No? No, you don't. Okay. So, okay, Linda, have a go at that one, and then I'll come back to you if there's a second.
Okay. That's a great question. And, for all of us, the older I get, the more I understand the entrenched mindset. There are some things that they are what they are, the way I know them to be. Technology is a great example. That keeps changing, and they say technology knowledge doubles every 11 months now. There's a commercial in the United States where 2 grandparents are waiting for the arrival of their grandchildren who are coming to visit. They're all excited about the visit. You see the grandchildren coming up to Grandma and Grandpa's house, and the Grandma and Grandpa arrive at the front door with a device in each hand, a computer, an iPad, a mobile device, and they say, "These aren't working. We're so glad you're here." the kids are there to deal with the technology because the grandparents just can't do it. So that, I get that. I do that with my own kids. And I don't want to learn it. I don't want to learn that new thing. I really don't. I just want them to handle it. So that there is that. I think that part of what has to happen when there are entrenched mindsets, they're there for a good reason. People are entrenched because they know what they know and, it works for them or it's the way they've always experienced it. You have to change people's experiences. So they say that seeing is believing, and I think that's part of it. If you're talking about new school models, for example, or new pedagogies, you have to go see where it's happening and spend some time with it and really get your skeptical questions answered and get immersed in it for a while. There are a variety of ways to do that. There was a program in New York City for a while where professional development was done in this resident teacher process where a teacher would go visit another teacher for 3 weeks and stay in their classroom and work together with them on a set of practices, really try it out, see what works, what doesn't work, get, coaching and so on. I've also seen in school reform efforts where some of the most skeptical members of the staff, who often have very good reasons for their skepticism, when they're asked to become the investigator, go to that other school, spend a week there or spend several days and figure out how they do this and ask all the hard questions and see what the downside is as well as the upside, see what the problems are as well as the possibilities, come back and help us understand it. Sometimes changing the role, changing the context, creating a new experience of the ideas that are under examination or discussion is the most important way to do it, because if it's just talk, I'm going to talk from what I know and what I've experienced, just having somebody talk back to me is not likely to change my mind. So I think we have to figure out ways to change people's experience.
Brilliant. Okay, let me take you to part 3, which I think in some ways is the most challenging. Linda, you did the opening distinguished lecture at ARA this year in Washington, D.C., and the focus of that was really about accountability, and particularly accountability within the context of the US. For me, it was a brilliant lecture on governance and leadership of a system. And if there's any system that's pretty tough, it's the US system. I mean, remember here...
Tell me about it.
We've got the benefit of actually a unitary system, a national system. Now, a lot of people will say that has got its own challenges, but let me put this to you. We are not talking about communities of learning as some kind of add-on. This is to be the central nervous system of a reconfigured system. But will the current system be seriously reconfigured so that the role of the centre and the local will be redefined and redesigned? Because otherwise it strikes me that other initiatives of this kind have been reappropriated by the current system and you don't get transformation. Yeah. Now, the minister has been preaching the gospel of transformation. And it would suggest that the role of the centre is much less that of regulator and provider and much more that of enabler and broker. Yeah. Now, we've got a real chance here, I think, to look at an advanced redesign of a system. But I just want you to say a word about what we have seen elsewhere and what advice you might give so that this can become the reality. Everybody now talks about the system, and you won't get fantastic learning across the entire system unless you know about all of the elements, get all of those lined up, maybe not so much aligned, but certainly a coherent system. And this morning the minister once again preached the gospel of coherence. So the minister's not in the room. You can be as bold as you like. You would have been anyway. but I just reckon this is the chance to say a thing or two about what is going to be necessary in order to be able to bring about this kind of change.
Yeah, that's a great, great question. If you think about it, I'm going to take it from the accountability perspective, because that's what governments typically, think is their job, is to, create accountability in the system in one way or another. In bureaucratic systems, the accountability is that somebody at the top says, here's what you need to do, and you're accountable for doing what you've been told to do, right? It's a compliance idea. We just recently in the U.S. went through test-based accountability, and you have to give tests and show progress on these tests, and then this idea of sanctions being tied to lack of progress, as though the problem is mostly motivation, and you've got to motivate school people because they're going to withhold their effort if you don't have a carrot and a stick. So your theory of what needs to be done to accomplish the goals has to shift if what you're trying to accomplish is this approach to learning that is deep and embedded in the experience of kids and communities and aimed at these very uncertain kinds of goals that we now have for what they need to know and be able to do, that they've got to be able to deal with uncertainty and be an actor in and an agent of their own learning. In that lecture, I talked about a new conception of accountability, which sort of has three parts, sort of like a triangle, that at the top, and this is what parents want schools to be accountable for. Number one, I want schools to engage my child in meaningful learning that will help them in their lives, that will empower them to find their potential, to make a great future, to be able to be productive and successful in this changing world. So everything has to focus on meaningful learning from that perspective. Secondly, to get that, I need professionals who not only know well how to achieve that kind of learning, they also know my own child well, because, of course, my child is special, just like yours is and everyone else's is. They have their unique brilliance and needs, and that professional has to know how to help my child achieve that kind of learning. And then third, the organization has to be resourced accountably with the resources needed to achieve those goals, and those have to be wisely used. So there's an idea about resource accountability. And to accomplish that, the job of the center of the federal government, if you will, or the national government, is to be sure that the goals that are laid out really are around meaningful forms of learning, and that the tools for accountability do not get in the way of that, and hopefully even encourage and support that kind of learning. That there is deep investment in the capacity of professionals to do this really complex work that is needed, so that professional learning is well resourced and well designed from the beginning of the career all the way through, to enable people to understand how to achieve these learning goals overall, and with specific children with different needs, different experiences, different cultural backgrounds and contexts. That all has to be part of that professional investment. And if the government doesn't make that investment adequately, they're going to be tempted to go back to the old compliance regulation because they won't trust the professionals. So they've got to make that investment productively and ensure that those opportunities of quality learning are always available. And then there have to be adequate resources, and this is a central governmental function. The resources have to be adequate to achieve the job. There have to be ways that leaders are empowered to know and have processes in place to spend those resources wisely. The central government should not overly constrain the uses of the resources, other than to be sure that there is a base and a platform that will allow equitability in the resources. That should mean, in today's world, that more money is being spent in contexts where kids have greater needs, so that those needs can be adequately resourced, and that there's a process by which the wise use of resources is informed by communities, is informed by the wisdom of educators and leaders who know the research about what's likely to work and how to invest the resources in places that are likely to give good payoff, but also that you're continually looking, that there's a continuous improvement process where you're looking at the outcomes of your efforts regularly, whether that's through surveys of teachers and parents and students about what they're experiencing in the system, whether it's measures of rich outcomes of learning that allow you to see how children are learning, whether it's things like graduation rates and those kind of milestone accomplishments. And then there's a process to say, how are we doing? Where do we feel that what we're accomplishing is working? Where do we feel we need to invest more learning, more effort, and an expectation, and this is a place where the government can play a role, to be sure that there is an improvement process accompanied by a learning process so that every learning community can make headway in the areas where they need to. That has to address the equity concerns that the government should have and that communities must have, that all groups of students are making progress and getting the right kind of programmatic supports to close equity gaps that exist and to ensure that everyone is moving forward together. So there's a lot of trust in that system, but there's also an expectation of processes for continually looking at where we are and where we need to go, and continually evolving improvement strategies and, where needed, innovation strategies to ensure that that progress is being made.
Well, Linda, I think we'll all be listening to that and, in effect, ticking off our own list of whether or not your description of a powerful system with a reconfigured centre is lining up with the way in which we open today's gathering. Because I have to say, I think as both an insider and an outsider, we're doing pretty well. And if Hekia Parada was here, and this is obviously the policy, the practice is yet to follow in full form. But you'd have to say that the agenda we've got here, colleagues, lines up very well with that kind of description of a powerful new design system. I've got one final question for you in a minute, but I just want to go to the floor in case others would like to pick up on an issue at the system level. From what Linda said and thinking about where you are in the system at the moment, then let me get a microphone to you straight away. And I've got a couple, so Linda, we won't have a break, we'll just go straight on. We can't hear Linda. Linda can't hear us. Okay, let's just pause long enough to see if we can get it back. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you very much. Let me just bring you back together. Unfortunately, we cannot re-establish the line, so let me just channel Linda, take the two questions as comments, and then I just want to make one final comment. So please, just introduce yourself, and the question was?
The question's over here, in fact.
Okay, we've got the microphone. Good. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Just at times of change, we often see the things that are new as extraordinary, and the things that went before as very ordinary, and we want to leave those behind.
Yep.
And it's a kind of baby with the bathwater thing. I think, particularly in the New Zealand context, we've done some stunning things around collaboration, managing change through New Zealand curriculum, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
that we've got to be really careful about not losing what's working well currently in terms of how we work. So if she had any comments on what she knows about ensuring that you don't lose what works already at a time of rapid, widespread change, I'd be interested in that.
Great. Okay, thank you. And the second question was, I think, here. Yeah.
Kate Gainsford from Northern Porirua Community of Learning that's really just expressed an interest in becoming one. I'm just really interested in hearing what the professor might say about the process of change, where you have what is a transformational policy setting, and you have some goodwill and some good movement across sectors towards a more collaborative way of working, but you still have a fairly dominant culture or policy setting that is compliance-driven. And how, in her experience, she has seen that circuit broken to achieve trust.
Yeah.
Because it really, that's what it boils down to.
Yeah.
And how does that happen, and who moves first? Or is it that simple, or is it much more complicated than that? I'm really interested in hearing her views on that.
Okay, now just before I respond on behalf of Linda, I want to make sure that she's not listening. Have we got to back up? We haven't. Okay, good, I'm safe. Let me try this, because we've spent many hours talking about precisely these issues. Let me try and handle it in this way. There are three dimensions that we are seeing as absolutely crucial internationally if we are going to build upon and respect and acknowledge all the work that's gone before, right? And be able to bring about the culture change, because we know that, to use that awful language, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Okay? So, one, we want to acknowledge fantastic work that's gone on in this place, and if you don't do that, and you attempt to rebrand the work without the acknowledgement, you lose this enormous goodwill. And this place has got fantastic work in networking, as you point out. I mean, we could have a whole conversation about the fact that for the last 5 years that's been going on before Coles, right? So we should just acknowledge that point. So those 2 points in mind, how do you acknowledge and build on, and how do you achieve the culture change? Now, the only difficulty is that not only does culture eat strategy for breakfast, politics eats culture. And I think we've got a real issue. There are three things that we are seeing in highly successful transitions or transformation efforts in other countries. One is they are really crystal clear about the mission. I thought that Linda's answer to the question, if you don't have a shared agreement about what the learning looks like, slippage will happen time and time again, and compliance will come back, because in the absence of holding people to account on that, we've got a problem. Now, I think actually we're getting pretty close in terms of actually determining a shared understanding of the challenges. I mean, this morning, I thought Hekia was saying, let's get the leadership in place as a way of building agreement around what was Linda's second point, that is a shared agenda. Yeah. The second is the authorising environment. The trouble is that the authorising environment is not just politics. It's the media, it's the profession, it's teacher unions, it's parents, right? All of those, if they are not worked well, and I'm now talking the politics of education, I don't mean government, right? I'm talking about the politics of education. If we can't figure out as a profession how to make sure that the messages are reinforcing each other, one of those stakeholders will play us off against another. And we are going to lose the momentum. And it's so easy then for the media, and I don't mean this deliberately, it's just the way in which the media operate, will pick up on what they see as a weakness and expose that and expand it. And all of a sudden, all of the good work that we are undertaking is going to get compromised. So I do think, I'll come back to how I think that the authorising environment is so vital. By the way, we are in a good shape here. This is not a political comment, but if you have continuity of political leadership over a period of time, rather than changes in government and ministers, right, and quite frankly bureaucrats, those changes make things very difficult for us. We've actually at least got an enabling condition around continuity and a commitment through to the end of this Parliament. Yeah? And the third, I think, is building the capacity. There's no point having great mission a really strong authorising environment that legitimises you, but lack of capacity to be able to deliver. So I thought her point about investing in leadership, which is after all what the Education Council is about. So my PS on all of this is, who's going to be the honest broker and the enabling force that will give us the recognition of what's gone before, building on our strengths, and ensure that in fact we don't lose the momentum and find that we're going to somehow be in a position where the authorising environment gets removed. This is not an advertisement now just for the Education Council, but the Education Council's actually been invested in responsibility for working with, i.e. is the profession. And ultimately, we've had a conversation about a profession-led system. Until we redesign the system, I still acknowledge the role of the centre, until we redesign the system where the profession seriously leads it. Now, I know they've got a lot of different language here about profession-led system, self-managing system, self-governing system. I just reckon we have, as a profession, have got to take on this responsibility, because in the end, if we don't, we will get compromised by the political environment or the stakeholder environment, and if we don't invest in our capacity, we will never be able to get to the stage where you can claim we are a profession-led system. I mean, that's the hope. So it strikes me that we are at a point now where we can have a conversation with our 5 panel members about how they see this work. Because, as you know, we had 5 commission papers that led to the production of the document that was circulated and released at the end of last year. But it does create an agenda. But behind that paper, we have 5 quite remarkable papers that I know many people in this room have read. And we wanted to make sure that we gave exposure to that before we go into this afternoon and think carefully about how we're actually implementing it. On your behalf, I don't know whether we can send a message just through applause to California, but it would be nice to be on record that we acknowledged having Professor Linda Darling-Hammond in the room. So thank you, Linda.